My finger hovered over the screen, a split second too late to undo the damage. The text read, "You look far too beautiful in that dress to be thinking about work. How about we skip the meeting and I take you somewhere quiet instead?" It was meant for a woman I'd been seeing, a playful, low-stakes flirtation. But as the delivered icon popped up, my blood turned to ice. I hadn't sent it to her. I had sent it to Eleanor Vance, my CEO. A woman who carried herself with the lethal precision of a diamond and a reputation for firing people for far less than harassment. I spent the next 4 minutes pacing my small apartment, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was already drafting my resignation in my head. Then, the silence was shattered, not by a phone call but by a sharp rhythmic pounding on my front door. I opened it and there she was. Still in her designer blazer, her eyes 2 emeralds of cold fire. She didn't look angry. She looked dangerously focused. She stepped into my space, forcing me back, her perfume filling the air. She held up her phone, the screen glowing with my words. "You have a lot of nerve," she whispered, her voice a low velvet rasp. "So let's see if you're as brave in person. Say it to my face." The silence in my narrow hallway was suffocating. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a siren outside. But here, inches away from Eleanor Vance, the world had shrunk to the space between our heartbeats. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, holding her phone like a weapon, waiting for me to crumble. "I'm waiting," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "You were quite bold behind a glass screen. Surely a man of your creative talents hasn't run out of words already?" I swallowed hard, my throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. My mind was screaming at me to apologize, to grovel, to blame it on a glitch or a glass of wine I hadn't even finished. But as I looked into her eyes, I didn't see the corporate executioner I saw in the boardroom. I saw a flicker of something else. A challenge, yes, but also a strange, starving kind of curiosity. I took a breath, letting the adrenaline steady my hands. I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "that you look far too beautiful in that dress to be thinking about work, and that I should take you somewhere quiet instead." The air in the room seemed to ignite. Eleanor's eyebrows arched, a small, dangerous smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She stepped closer, the heels of her boots clicking sharply on my hardwood floor. She was so close now that I could see the golden flecks in her irises and the slight tension in her jaw. "Is that right?" she teased, her tone shifting from icy to something more feline. "And where, exactly, would a humble assistant like you take someone like me? Somewhere with plastic chairs and a happy hour menu?" I couldn't help it. A small laugh escaped me. The fear was still there, but the absurdity of the situation was starting to take over. "Actually," I said, leaning back against the wall to reclaim a sense of ground, "I was thinking of a rooftop garden, I know. No plastic chairs. Just the city lights and enough silence to actually hear yourself think. But I suppose a CEO of your stature prefers the sound of clicking keyboards and quarterly projections." She let out a sharp, dry exhale that was almost a laugh. "You're incredibly cocky for someone who's one HR report away from unemployment. And you're incredibly dedicated to your job for someone who drove across the city at 9 p.m. just to confront a typo," I countered. The banter felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. It was exhilarating and terrifying. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering a second too long on my collarbone before returning to my eyes. For a moment, the mask slipped. The cold CEO persona, the one that had earned her a reputation for being untouchable, flickered. In its place was a woman who looked tired, not sleepy but weary. The kind of weariness that comes from years of building walls so high that no one even tries to climb them anymore. She looked around my modest apartment. The stacks of books, the worn leather chair, the half-finished sketch on my desk. It was a world away from the glass and steel fortress she lived in. "It's quiet here," she murmured, almost to herself. The sharp edge in her voice had softened into something velvet and thick. She turned back to me, her expression unreadable. "You didn't mean to send that to me. We both know that." "I didn't," I admitted, the sincerity finally cutting through the teasing. "But that doesn't mean the words weren't true, Eleanor." Using her first name felt like a physical blow. She stiffened, her breath hitching for a fraction of a second. The romantic tension was no longer a joke. It was a physical weight in the room, pulling us toward each other like a tide. I realized then that she wasn't here to fire me. She was here because, for the first time in a long time, someone had looked at her and seen a woman instead of a title, even if it was by mistake. She took a half step back, reclaiming her professional armor, but the glow in her eyes remained. "Don't think this means you're excused from the morning briefing," she said, though the threat had no teeth. "And if you ever accidentally text me again, you'll come back to my door," I teased, a bold grin spreading across my face. She paused at the threshold, looking over her shoulder. "I might do more than just knock next time." Before I could respond, she was gone, leaving only the scent of sandalwood and the echo of a heartbeat that wasn't just mine. If you want to know what happens when I show up to the office the next morning and see her in that same dress, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this mess I've made. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of her standing in my doorway, the way her voice had dropped when she said, "Say it to my face," the way her eyes had softened, just briefly, when she looked around my apartment like she was reading a language she hadn't spoken in years. The way she'd paused at the threshold before leaving, her parting words hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. I might do more than just knock next time. I must have turned my phone over in my hands a dozen times before finally setting it face down on the nightstand. I was not going to text her again. That much I had firmly decided. What I hadn't decided was what to do with the fact that I was already thinking about her in ways that had nothing to do with the morning briefing. The office the next morning was its usual cathedral of quiet ambition. Glass walls, hushed conversations, the soft percussion of keyboards. I arrived early, as I always did, and took my position at my desk just outside her corner office. The distance between my desk and her door was exactly 11 steps. I had counted them on my first day. Now they felt like 11 miles. She arrived at 8:47 a.m., 3 minutes ahead of her usual schedule. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and a deep burgundy blouse, her dark hair pinned precisely at the back of her neck. She walked past my desk without looking at me, but just before she pushed open her office door, she paused. "Mr. Collins," she said, her voice crisp and professionally distant, "I'll need the Henderson file on my desk in 10 minutes. And coffee." "Black?" "Of course, Miss Vance," I replied, equally measured. She disappeared behind the glass door, and I sat there for a full 3 seconds before allowing myself to exhale. This was going to be our unspoken arrangement then. Out here in the world of glass and quarterly reports, we were what we had always been. Nothing had changed. Nothing would be acknowledged. We were professionals. I brought the Henderson file and the coffee in exactly 9 minutes. When I set them down on her desk, she didn't look up from her screen. But as I turned to leave, her voice stopped me. "Close the door," she said quietly. I did. The shift was immediate, the rigid posture relaxed by a single degree. She finally looked up, and the Eleanor from last night, the one with golden flecks in her irises and a tired honesty behind her eyes, was looking back at me. "I want to be very clear about something," she said, lacing her fingers together on the desk. "What happened last night was an anomaly." "Completely," I agreed, keeping my expression neutral. "It won't affect our professional dynamic." "Of course not." She studied me for a long moment, as if testing the sincerity of my answers. Then something broke loose in the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "You're very agreeable this morning." "I've been told it's one of my better qualities," I said. "Don't push it, Collins," she replied, but there was no ice in it. She picked up the Henderson file, signaling the conversation was over. Then, just as I reached the door again, she spoke once more, her voice lower this time, almost private. "The rooftop garden you mentioned. Is it actually worth visiting, or were you just being clever?" I turned slowly. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the file, but her pen had stopped moving. "It's worth it," I said honestly, "especially on a clear night." She nodded once, barely perceptibly, and went back to reading. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and stared at my computer screen without seeing a single word on it, because something fragile and terrifying had just been born in the space between us. Not named, not claimed, but breathing. Quietly, like a small flame in a very large, very cold room. And I already knew, with the certainty of someone standing at the edge of something irreversible, that I would do nothing to extinguish it. If you're feeling this story, drop a comment below and tell me, would you have said it to her face? I genuinely want to know. And don't forget to subscribe so you're here when things get complicated. It started with small things. A coffee left on my desk on a Tuesday morning with no explanation. Black, the way I took it, not the way she took hers. A slight nod when I walked into a room full of people who barely registered my existence. A text at 11:14 p.m. on a Wednesday that simply read, "The Henderson merger went through. Good work on the brief. Professional, measured." But it was 11:14 p.m., and Eleanor Vance did not send late-night texts to her assistants about things that could wait until morning. I was learning her language, and it was spoken entirely in the margins. It was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the night she'd knocked on my door, when the first real crack appeared in her armor. We had been working late, just the two of us, the rest of the floor long since emptied, going over a contract that needed revisions before the morning. She had taken off her blazer at some point, draping it over the back of her chair, and was sitting across from me at the conference table in just her blouse, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked different without the blazer, softer, more human. "You're staring," she said, without looking up from the contract. "I'm thinking," I corrected. "About the contract? About the fact that you've reread that same paragraph 4 times in the last 10 minutes. She looked up then, and for a moment, something unguarded crossed her face before she shuttered it. She pulled off her glasses and set them on the table, pressing her fingers to the bridge of her nose. "Long day," she said simply. "Long month," I replied gently. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers still pressed to her face. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling, a gesture so uncharacteristically unguarded that it stopped my breath. "Do you ever wonder," she said, her voice stripped of all its corporate precision, "if you've spent so long being good at something that you've forgotten how to be good at anything else?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I set down my pen. "What do you mean?" She gestured vaguely at the glass walls around us, at the empire she had built. "This, all of this, I know exactly who I am in here. Every decision, every outcome, every risk. I can calculate it. I can control it." She paused, her eyes dropping to the table. "Out there, I am apparently catastrophically bad at reading people." I knew, without her saying the name, that she was talking about her marriage, about whoever had stood beside her and chosen betrayal anyway. "He didn't deserve to read you," I said quietly. Her eyes snapped to mine, sharp, alert, like I had touched something she hadn't expected me to reach. "I never said it was a he," she said carefully. "You didn't have to," I replied. "The way you said reading people, it wasn't general, it was specific, and it was personal." A long silence stretched between us. She held my gaze for what felt like a full minute, searching my face for something, pity perhaps, or morbid curiosity. She found neither. I wasn't looking at her like a wounded thing. I was looking at her the way you look at someone whose depth you've only just begun to understand. "He was someone I trusted completely," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A business partner first, then a husband. I thought those two things made him safe." A dry, humorless sound escaped her. "It turns out that someone who knows all your professional vulnerabilities also knows exactly how to dismantle you personally." I didn't say anything. I just let the words exist in the air without rushing to fill the silence with hollow comfort. She seemed to appreciate that, the not rushing. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, quiet, grateful. Fragile in the way that only the genuinely strong can be fragile. "You're easy to talk to," she said finally, as though the realization surprised her. "I'm not sure how I feel about that." "Take your time," I said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at me for one long, tender moment. Then she picked up her glasses, put them back on, and returned to the contract. But the room felt different now. Warmer. Like something cold and locked had been opened just a crack, and the light that came through it was the most honest thing either of us had seen in a very long time. I wasn't just attracted to her anymore. I cared, deeply, quietly, in the way that matters most. The kind that doesn't ask for anything in return. 3 weeks later, the world outside decided it had been quiet long enough. I saw it first on my phone, on a Monday morning, while I was still on the subway. A headline from one of those financial gossip columns that dressed itself up as serious journalism. Vance Enterprises in merger talks with Harlow Group. CEO's ex-husband Daniel Harlow at the helm. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Daniel Harlow. I had heard that name once, in a financial briefing, as a rival. I had never connected it to her. To the quiet devastation she had described in that conference room 3 weeks ago. To the man who had known all her professional vulnerabilities and used them personally. I put my phone in my pocket and spent the rest of the subway ride staring at the floor. When I arrived at the office, I knew immediately that she already knew. The energy on the floor was different. Tighter, like a room where someone had been shouting just before you walked in. Her office blinds, which she rarely closed, were shut. Her assistant before me, a nervous young woman named Petra who handled scheduling, was sitting at her outer desk with the rigid posture of someone who had already been spoken to sharply once this morning and had no intention of it happening again. I set Eleanor's coffee on the corner of Petra's desk and said nothing. Petra looked at me with wide eyes and mouthed, "Don't." I nodded and went to my desk. For 2 hours the blinds stayed closed. Then, at precisely 10:30 a.m., her office door opened and she walked out carrying a leather portfolio, her face a portrait of absolute composure. She was wearing the armor again, every layer of it, the jaw set, the eyes clear and cold, the posture immaculate. She looked at no one. She walked directly to the elevator and disappeared. She didn't return until after lunch. The whispers started by Wednesday. I caught fragments of them in the break room and in the elevator. Colleagues speculating about the merger, about Daniel Harlow's reappearance, and then, inevitably, about her, about why she looked different lately, about whether the rumored softening in her demeanor was connected to anyone in the office. I heard my name once, spoken low between 2 colleagues who didn't see me standing just around the corner. It was said with a smirk, the way people say things they intend as gossip but land as grenades. I walked away before I heard anything else. But the damage was already done, because I knew that in an office this size, words traveled faster than truth. She pulled away from me that same afternoon. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't announced. It was just suddenly, quietly real. The morning coffee on my desk stopped appearing. The late-night texts ceased. When I brought files to her office, she thanked me with the precise professional courtesy she used with everyone else, her eyes focused on her screen, her tone clipped and even. The 11 steps between my desk and her door had somehow become 11 miles again. I told myself she was under pressure, that the reappearance of Daniel Harlow in her professional world was a genuine crisis, and that she needed space to navigate it. I told myself all of this with the careful logic of a man trying very hard not to feel what he was already feeling. It didn't work. On Friday evening, as the office emptied and I sat at my desk, pretending to finish a report I had already finished an hour ago, I watched her walk past me without pausing, without the almost smile, without the half-second of eye contact that had become the quiet language we shared. She pushed through the glass doors and was gone. I sat alone in the empty office, the city lights beginning to flicker on beyond the windows, and asked myself the question I had been avoiding all week. Had any of it been real for her? Or had I been, without knowing it, simply a temporary warmth she had borrowed during a cold season? Someone to be set aside the moment the real world came knocking again. If you want to know what I did next, whether I walked away or finally said the thing I'd been holding back for weeks, make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell. Because what happens next changes everything. I gave her a week. 7 days of professional distance, of clean boundaries, of being exactly what my job title said I was and nothing more. I answered emails promptly. I prepared briefs accurately. I delivered coffee without lingering. I was, by every measurable standard, a model assistant. And every single day of that week felt like swallowing glass, because I knew the difference now. I knew what it felt like when she looked at me like I was a person rather than a function. I knew the specific quality of silence that existed between us when we were both pretending not to feel what we were feeling. And I knew, with the kind of clarity that only arrives after enough sleepless nights, that what had grown between us in those quiet weeks was not something I was willing to simply file away and forget. It was a Thursday evening when I finally stopped being careful. The office had emptied early, some company function that I had declined, citing a backlog of work that was only partially fabricated. Eleanor had stayed too, though I suspected for entirely different reasons. Facing a room full of colleagues who were quietly speculating about her personal life was probably not how she wanted to spend a Thursday evening. I knocked on her open office door at 7:15 p.m. She looked up from her screen, and for a fraction of a second, just one unguarded fraction, something warm moved through her eyes before she extinguished it. "Collins," she said, her voice neutral. "I thought you'd left." "I stayed," I said simply. I walked in and placed a paper bag on the corner of her desk. "There's a decent Thai place 2 blocks over. You haven't eaten since this morning." She looked at the bag, then at me. "You're observant for someone who's supposed to be looking at spreadsheets." "I'm observant because I pay attention to you," I said, and I didn't dress it up or walk it back. I just let it stand there, honest and unadorned. Her jaw tightened. She looked back at her screen. "That kind of observation is something you should probably keep to yourself in this environment, given the current." "Eleanor." I said her name the way I had that first night, like a door being gently but firmly opened. She stopped. "I'm not talking about this environment right now. I'm talking about you, and me, and the fact that you've spent the last week treating me like a stranger because you're frightened." The silence that followed was the loudest I had ever heard. She rose from her chair slowly, moving to the window, her back to me, her arms folding across her chest. A gesture I had come to recognize as her version of holding herself together. The city spread out beneath her like a glittering circuit board. "You don't know what frightened looks like on me," she said quietly. "I know exactly what it looks like," I replied, moving to stand beside her, close enough that our reflections overlapped in the glass. "It looks like closed blinds on a Monday morning. It looks like coffee that stops appearing on someone's desk. It looks like walking past someone without making eye contact, because making eye contact might mean admitting something you're not ready to say out loud." Her reflection's eyes closed briefly. When they opened, there was no ice in them, only something raw and exhausted and real. "He made me feel foolish," she said, her voice barely holding its shape. "Daniel. He made me feel like every soft thing I had ever shown him was a weakness he was cataloging for later. And I swore after that," her voice broke slightly, just at the edge of it, "I swore I would never give anyone that kind of access again." I turned to face her fully, and after a moment she turned too. We were close. Close enough that I could see the precise moment her composure began its surrender. "I'm not him," I said. "I know that," she whispered. "That's what terrifies me." My chest ached with the weight of what she had just handed me, the most honest thing she had ever said. I reached out and very gently, very slowly, covered her hand with mine. She looked down at our hands. She didn't pull away. "The text I sent you by mistake," I said quietly. "The feelings behind it weren't a mistake. They were already there. I just hadn't been brave enough to send them intentionally." She looked up at me, her eyes luminous and unguarded, standing at the precise edge of a decision that would change everything. And then her phone rang. Daniel Harlow's name lit up the screen between us like a flare fired across a battlefield. She looked at it. Then she looked at me, and in that single suspended moment I saw her choose. Not him, not the phone, not the fear, but the wall. She stepped back, her hand slipping from beneath mine, her expression shuddering with a quiet devastation that was worse than anger. "I need to take this," she said. I nodded once. I picked up my jacket from the chair, and I walked out of her office without looking back, because looking back would have undone me completely. If this story is hitting somewhere deep, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want to know whether she chooses the wall or chooses him, subscribe and stay close. The final chapter is the one that will stay with you. She called me on a Sunday, not a text. Not an email routed through the professional courtesy of office communication. A phone call at 6:43 in the evening, while I was sitting in my worn leather chair with a book I hadn't been reading for the better part of an hour. When her name appeared on my screen, I sat very still for 2 full rings, the way you sit still when something fragile is happening and you don't want to disturb the air around it. I answered. "I didn't take the call," she said. No greeting, no preamble. Just that, offered into the silence like something she had been carrying all week, and finally set down. I closed my book. "Eleanor, I let it go to voicemail," she continued, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. Not the quiet of composure. The quiet of someone who had made a decision that cost them something. And then I deleted the voicemail without listening to it. And then I sat in my apartment for 3 days, trying to convince myself that was a mistake, a pause. It wasn't. I didn't speak. I let her find her way to whatever she had called to say. "I've been thinking about what you said," she continued. "That the feelings weren't a mistake, just the timing." Another pause, longer this time. "I've spent 2 years being very, very careful, Collins. Careful about who I let close. Careful about what I show and what I protect and what I never, under any circumstances, allow to become someone else's weapon." Her breath was uneven at the edges. "And then you accidentally sent me a text message about a dress, and somehow that was the beginning of the most honest thing that has happened to me in years." Which is, she let out a small, helpless sound that was almost a laugh. "Which is completely absurd." "Completely," I agreed softly. "I'm outside your building," she said. I was at the door before she could knock. She was standing in the hallway in a simple dark coat, her hair down for the first time I had ever seen, falling past her shoulders in soft waves that made her look entirely, devastatingly human. No blazer, no armor, just Eleanor. She was holding a small paper bag from the tie place 2 blocks from the office, and when she saw my expression, something in her face broke open into the most unguarded smile I had ever seen on her. "You brought food," I said. "You said you pay attention to me," she replied, her voice warm and a little unsteady. "I'm learning to pay attention, too." I stepped back and let her in. We sat on my living room floor. Because the coffee table was covered in books, I hadn't bothered to move, eating from paper containers while the city hummed its Sunday evening song beyond the windows. The floor lamp cast everything in amber. She had her back against the couch and her shoes off, and she was laughing, genuinely laughing, at a story I was telling about my first week as her assistant, when I had accidentally filed an entire merger brief under a folder labeled Miscellaneous Sandwiches due to a catastrophic keyboard error. "You never told me that," she said, pressing her hand over her mouth. "I was terrified of you," I said honestly. "And now?" she asked, her laughter settling into something softer, her eyes finding mine across the amber-lit room. I looked at her, really looked at her. At the woman who had knocked on my door with fire in her eyes and loneliness in her bones, who had sat across conference tables from me and slowly, reluctantly, let me see her. Who had stood at the edge of fear and, on a Sunday evening, chosen to walk toward something instead. "Now," I said quietly, "I'm just glad you're here." She held my gaze for a long, tender moment. Then she reached across the small space between us and laced her fingers through mine, the way you hold something you finally trust yourself not to break. "That text you sent me by mistake," she murmured, her thumb tracing slow circles on the back of my hand. "I'm glad you have terrible aim." I laughed, low and full, and she leaned her head against my shoulder, and the city outside kept its gentle noise, and the room held us both in its warmth like it had been waiting a long time for exactly this. What started as the most mortifying mistake of my professional life had become the most honest, the most tender, the most quietly extraordinary thing I had ever stumbled into. And this time, not a single part of it was an accident. If this story found you at the right moment, if it reminded you that sometimes the best things begin with the worst timing, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. I'll see you in the next one.